Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got a Commander's Guild deck tech for you. This is deck number 208 and it's titled You've Activated My Trap Card. Now if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards. So if you are interested in suggesting cards, please do put them in the comments below. We are working with a budget of $100 or less and building a Commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, this week, our random card is going to be suggested by Emotional Channel 371 over on Reddit, and that card is Comeuppance. So, Comeuppance is 3 and a white for an instant. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and planeswalkers you control this turn by sources you don't control. If damage from a creature source is prevented this way, Comeuppance deals that much damage to that creature. If damage from a non-creature source is prevented this way, Comeuppance deals that much damage to the source's controller. So that's a lot of words, but basically what it means is it's protecting us for a turn. And I wasn't 100% sure where to go with this card originally, but I realized that this is my favorite kind of genre of card or type of card, are the ones that can protect us from what our opponents are doing. And so with that in mind, I immediately jumped to a specific commander that I thought would work really well with those types of effects. And that is going to be Sevinne the Chronoclasm. So Sevinne is 2 blue, red, white for a 2/2 human wizard. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to Sevinne the Chronoclasm. And whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard each turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, you may notice that a lot of times when people play Sevinne, they're looking at that second ability, casting stuff from the graveyard. That is obviously not going to be our main focus because of Comeuppance. We don't really intend to cast a lot of stuff from our graveyard. But what really interests me about Sevinne is that first ability, preventing all damage that would be dealt to Sevinne. Being able to have him in play and being able to kind of act as pretty much the perfect blocker, never taking damage, making sure that nothing's ever going to get through him, means that it, along with Comeuppance, kind of plays a very good protection role. So while I wouldn't necessarily call this deck a pillow fort deck because we don't really intend to fortify ourselves too much, we do want to find ways to skirt around attacks and damage. So with that being said, let's break down some of the actual themes in the deck and talk about why some of this works and what we're trying to do. So the very first theme is probably my favorite theme because it involves cards like Aetherize. This is just straight up punishing our opponents for attacking us. A lot of times there are cards like Ghostly Prison or Propaganda that just prevent an opponent from attacking you or force them to pay mana to attack you. And while we do have some of that in the deck as well, we really want to pass with all of our mana open and just look at our opponents and know that if they attack us, we are going to find a way to punish their attacks. That's, in this case with Aetherize, 3 and a blue for an instant, return all attacking creatures to their owner's hands. This is one of the better effects like this because you'll notice Aetherize does no targeting, so it doesn't target the player, it doesn't target the creatures, it just returns them to their owner's hand. So as long as we are able to hold up the 4 mana, which given a lot of the spells in our deck is not a difficult thing to do, then we can always rest assured that we have ways to protect ourselves at any given point in the game. Moving on to our second theme is another way to prevent attacks, but not quite in the punishing way that Aetherize is, because that is with creatures that deal damage to any target whenever they are dealt damage. So for example, we have Boros Reckoner, which is 3 hybrid red-white for a 3/3 Minotaur Wizard. Whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target, then we can pay a red or white and give it first strike until the end of turn. So if someone were to attack us with, say, a 10/10, we can block with the Reckoner and then do 10 damage to any target. That can be players, creatures, planeswalkers. So this is another way to kind of disincentivize attacks, because if we have these creatures ready to block, our opponents really aren't going to want to attack into them because they don't want that damage redirected at them. So we are setting ourselves up pretty much in a position where our opponents are always able to attack us, but we really want to play this politics game to force them to go somewhere else, kind of doing our dirty work for us, and then allowing us to close out the game with our Boros Reckoner effects while still protecting ourselves with our Aetherize effects. And then, of course, last but not least, we come to our third theme of the deck, and this one is misdirection. Being able to protect ourselves from attacks is great, but we also need to have ways to protect ourselves from spells. Obviously, because we're in blue, we have things like counter spells, but we don't necessarily want to counter everything that comes at us if we can redirect it to something else. So a good example of that is Bolt Bend, which is 3 and a red for an instant. It costs 3 less to cast if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. That's not going to come up super often in our deck, but it can come up. And it simply says, change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So what this allows us to do is if someone points a removal spell at one of our creatures, we can cast Bolt Bend to change the target of that removal spell to something that we don't control, effectively allowing us to keep what we have and use our opponent's removal spells against themselves. And that can be incredibly powerful because no matter what we're doing, we are protecting ourselves from combat, from direct damage, and from removal spells, putting us in a position where as long as we have mana open, we should be able to close out the game and protect ourselves throughout whatever our opponents decide to do. But those are all of our themes for this week. And the next thing we got to do, of course, is take a look at some key cards. And these are cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions or even value engines all on their own. So the very first card I want to talk about is Aboleth Spawn. And this is a card that every time I play it really just impresses me more and more. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/3 fish horror. It has Flash, Ward 2, and Probing Telepathy. So whenever a creature entering the battlefield under an opponent's control causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, you may copy that ability and you may choose new targets for the copy. So any enter the battlefield effects that our opponents get, we also get. And while that doesn't seem initially that powerful because we can't control what our opponents are doing, there are so many incredibly powerful ETBs that exist in Magic that by being able to just benefit from our opponents playing the game can put us in a position where we're able to outvalue everybody else because we are not paying for those abilities. Our opponents are paying for the creatures and we are just getting the effects for free while they spent the mana. The other nice thing about Aboleth Spawn is because it has Flash, we can actually flash it in response to someone casting a creature with an ETB, so they might not even know that we have it. And this can be game winning, especially if it's something that maybe makes a ton of tokens or does a ton of damage, something that then requires the player to untap with that creature, because we get to untap first, presumably as long as it's not happening at instant speed, and take advantage of that ETB before our opponents can. So while this doesn't directly influence our opponents attacking us, it does put us in a position to be able to win once we've successfully shut down attacks. Moving on to our second key card, this one is going to be Pariah. And Pariah is 2 and a white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. All damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to enchanted creature instead. So if we think back to our commander Sevinne, Sevinne says that all damage dealt to him is prevented. If we can put Pariah on Sevinne, we can no longer take damage because all of that damage is directed at our commander, and our commander prevents all damage that is dealt to him. So as long as we have Sevinne with Pariah, we cannot take damage, and unless our opponents board wipe or direct kill Sevinne, they have no way of getting through combat damage with non-combat damage. This puts us in a position where our opponents have to remove our commander in order to knock us out of the game, unless they do something like mill or drain, which is a lot less common than direct damage or combat damage. So while this is not a surefire protection spell, it's at least something that can buy us time to get to where we need to be. And there are going to be some decks that just cannot deal with it. If we're running against any decks that don't have board wipes or don't have single targeted removal, or even then, maybe they do and we have plenty of ways to get around it, they just might not be able to win the game. So that is something to be aware of. So if that's your play group and you feel this might be a little too much, you can always, of course, just take it out. Moving on to our final key card. This one is Aurelia, the Law Above. Now, Aurelia is one of those cards that doesn't necessarily punish our opponents for attacking, but it really incentivizes our opponents to not go super wide, because it's 3 red-white for a 4/4 angel. She has flying, vigilance, and haste, and whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. Then whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia deals 3 damage to each of your opponents, and you gain 3 life. Being able to trigger this on everybody's turn is incredibly powerful, drawing us a ton of cards, doing a ton of damage, but it also puts our opponents in a position where they may not want to attack with their entire board because they don't want us to get the value from Aurelia. This also means, of course, we can trigger Aurelia if we attack with enough creatures. That is probably not going to happen. We don't tend to have that many creatures, but it is something to be aware of. So while she isn't directly preventing attacks from coming at us, she is a great example of punishing attacks, because not only do our opponents not want to attack us specifically, and even if they do, we do have a 4/4 flying vigilance creature to defend, it means that they may not want to attack much at all. And while that doesn't initially sound like a very good thing for us if none of our opponents are attacking, once we get into the cool interactions for this deck, you'll kind of understand why that's actually pretty good. And so, without any more further ado, let's actually get into those cool interactions and talk about some cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases are just fun cards that I want to highlight. Now, I will be honest, going into this one, this is where our win conditions are, because we are protecting ourselves and we don't intend on doing a lot of combat damage. We do have a handful of infinite combos to win the game. And those are the cards that I would like to highlight in the cool interactions. So if you're not a fan of infinite combos, then you can obviously just remove one or both pieces of the combo. But I think it's worth including and talking about so everybody knows what's going on. So the first cool interaction I want to highlight is one of my personal favorites. It is Narumeha, Master Wizard, and Ghostly Flicker. So Narumeha is 2 blue for a 3/3 human wizard. She has flash, and when she enters the battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. And of course, other wizards you control get +1/+1. Ghostly Flicker is 2 and a blue for an instant. Exile 2 artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, then return them to the battlefield under your control. So if we cast Ghostly Flicker, and then, with it on the stack, cast Narumeha, we can copy the Ghostly Flicker and choose new targets for it. As long as one of those targets is Narumeha, then the copy will resolve, Narumeha will come back into play, the original Ghostly Flicker will still be on the stack, and she can copy it again, essentially allowing us to copy it an infinite number of times, and that means the second target will be also blinked an infinite number of times. And that could be an artifact, creature, or land. The reason that that's going to be so important is because we can actually tap the land in response to the Ghostly Flicker, making infinite mana. If we have any creatures that do damage or maybe mill an opponent or do something else when they enter the battlefield, we can get that an infinite number of times. There are plenty of ways for us to win once this combo hits the board. And it's one of those combos that, while, yes, it doesn't win immediately, the nice thing about Narumeha and Ghostly Flicker is that they have flash and are an instant respectively, so we can do this at any moment in the game, meaning we can do it when an opponent taps down so they have no removal or counter spells. We can do it in response to some big activation. It gives us a lot of flexibility in what we're doing, when we're doing it, and letting us win the game as well. Moving on to our second cool interaction. This one is also an infinite combo. This one between Brash Taunter and Blazing Sunsteel. So again, we're trying to win the game. We're trying not to be attacked. And Brash Taunter and Blazing Sunsteel both do that on their own, but together they actually just win us the game outright. So Brash Taunter, 4 and a red for a 1/1 goblin, it has indestructible. Whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent, and you can pay 2 and a red and tap it to fight another target creature. Blazing Sunsteel is 1 and a red for an artifact equipment. An equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each opponent you have. Whenever equipped creature is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target, then it equips for 4. If we can equip the Brash Taunter with the Blazing Sunsteel and then do damage to the Brash Taunter, whether it's through attacking, blocking, or even just activating its own ability, we will then trigger both the Brash Taunter and the Blazing Sunsteel. So if, for example, Brash Taunter takes 1 damage while it's equipped, it will then do 1 damage to target opponent, and Blazing Sunsteel will have the Brash Taunter do 1 damage to any target. We can have it do that 1 damage to itself. That triggers it again, doing another 1 damage to an opponent and another 1 damage to itself, allowing us to do an infinite number of damage to each opponent. And yes, that is also an infinite number of damage to the Brash Taunter, but it has indestructible, so it survives that whole thing. Now, again, this is an infinite combo, and it is a directly winning the game combo, but it does require your opponents to have no interaction, and it also requires them to not have any way to prevent damage to themselves. So if somebody has their own Comeuppance, for example, they could stop it. If somebody has anything that would say that they have a hexproof, we're not able to target them. So this, again, just like Narumeha, is not a surefire way to win the game, but I would argue that most of the time, probably 9 out of 10 times, this does just win the game when it resolves. So if you're not an infinite combo person, or that's not what your table's about, then obviously you can remove one of these. I would recommend the Sunsteel because Brash Taunter still has at least a role to play, but I did want to highlight it so everybody knows what's in the deck. But moving on from our cool interactions, we're going to get to the budget portion of this deck. And this week, our budget came in at $56.78, so pretty cheap overall, almost half of our total budget. And our most expensive card is actually a pretty new card in Aven Interrupter at 1 white for a 2/2 bird rogue, has flash flying. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell, it becomes plotted, and spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast. That is $4.52. I imagine it's mainly because, 1, this is just a really good card, but also I think it sees a little bit of play in Standard and Pioneer. Not a ton, but enough to make the price a little bit higher than normal. With that being said, though, this is not an absurdly expensive spell. I think it's worth keeping in the deck if you can, especially because plotting cards is actually surprisingly powerful. Mainly because if we can force our opponents to plot something like a counterspell, it then becomes impossible to cast because you can only cast spells that have been plotted as sorceries. So it automatically just removes counterspells from the game. It can make removal spells have to be cast at sorcery speed rather than as instants. It really just changes the way that those spells interact. So I do think Aven Interrupter is a good card to have. But if you do need to trim it for budget purposes, you can replace it with probably another counterspell because that's mostly what we're going to be using it for. And a lot of those are very cheap, so you can definitely trim on budget for that. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And the card that I would recommend putting in, if given the chance, is Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, which is, again, not super expensive, but a little bit outside of what we normally want to be spending on our cards at $4.16. But Lear is 3 blue for a 3/4, spells can't be countered, and each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. Lear is one of those cards that doesn't look like it does much for our deck on the surface, but forcing things to not be countered is very powerful when we want to sneak through one of our infinite combos, and Giving every instant and sorcery card in our graveyard flashback means we can actually double up on those spells with Sevinne. And flashback does not have to be cast at sorcery speed, so we can use Comeuppance again on our opponent's turn. We can flash things back and continuously use a lot of our protection spells because our opponents can't really play around it. If they know we've already cast it once, it's in the graveyard, they either have to attack us and force us to use it, or they just don't attack us and we kind of get some free value out of it anyway. Now, if you are putting Leer into the deck, you would have to take a card out of the deck, and the card I would recommend taking out is Venser Shaper Savant, which is 2 blue for a 2/2 human wizard. He has flash, and when he enters, return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. This is one of those cards that is not a bad card by any means. Keeping it in the deck is not a bad call. But I honestly struggled a lot with trying to figure out what to cut for Leer. And as weird as it is, I think Venser kind of fits everything we want it to do, except it's also a creature, as weird as that sounds. A lot of our synergies tend to focus on creatures that want to be taking damage, which Venser is not, or instants that we can cast and then replay from our graveyard. Venser, unfortunately, falls just a little bit short. Now, again, that's not to say it's a bad card. Venser is still very good. It acts as a counterspell for uncounterable spells, which is very powerful. And it's a great instant speed blocker for times when you just really need it. But it's not Leer levels of powerful. So if you did have to choose between the two, I do think Leer is going to give you more value in the long term. Venser, again, not a terrible card, but definitely one you can replace if you need to. However, that now brings us to the end of our deck tech for this week. And the last thing I want to do before we jump into a game with this deck, because obviously we got to get a game in, we got to see how it plays, is I want to highlight some of our patrons, our channel members, and also highlight the Patreon itself, because everyone that's a part of it is doing an amazing job, and I do want to thank them, and also, obviously, as always, suggest that you join it because I think it's pretty cool. So a shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members. A thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, and the Oak Monster. To all of you, thank you all so much. And I have been told by everybody in the Discord, which are another reward you could get for joining the Patreon. So if you want to be a part of our Discord, where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel, you can check us out over there. That is at the $5 level. But everyone in my Discord has told me that I should also announce, for the $7 level, you get a card sent to you every month from me. It is one of the random cards that we build around. But what I haven't really told people is I also write a little note to everybody and also include a hand-drawn token from me. So if you were interested in receiving one of those hand-drawn tokens, I will be honest, I am not a beautiful artist. Some of my art has appeared on the channel before, but I think they're a ton of fun, and apparently my Discord agrees because they told me I should be highlighting it more, and I haven't been. So if that is something that interests you, please do check us out over on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. But with enough of those self-shoutouts out of the way, let's check out our opponents for this week and see how our deck can do in a game. So first up, we of course have our three opponents. We have Cole playing Kami of the Crescent Moon, Luke playing Jorkadine the Prevailer, and Jason playing the Swarm Lord. So starting off with Cole and his Kami deck, this is a draw 2 style of deck. He really just wants to draw as many cards as possible, and then use the cards that say, when you draw your second card each turn, do whatever. Because Kami just lets him draw a second card on his turn, so he can trigger those effects very efficiently, very effectively, and pretty much every single turn. So this is a deck that I'm really not sure what to expect from it. It feels vaguely group huggy, but I also know that mono blue is anything besides group hug. It can really just put in a ton of work at shutting everyone down. So I'm sure he has ways to make sure he benefits and the rest of us don't, but I'm very excited to see what he can do. Next up, we have Luke and his Jorkadine deck. This is another one of Luke's budget rare deck. So what he really wants to do is play as many bulk rares as possible. That means bulk rares that are about 25 cents or less, and they do specifically have to be rares, other than the basic lands. So that means he can't play any commons or uncommons. He can't play any mythic rares. They're all rares that are bulk. And while that doesn't initially seem very powerful, the way that Magic functions is there are a lot of very powerful cards that are very cheap. Maybe it's because of reprints, or they're only good in certain archetypes, and we've seen a mono white bulk rare list from Luke before, so I have no doubt that a Boros list can probably put in some work, and it's definitely one to watch out for. And then last but not least, we have Jason and his Swarmlord deck. This is a deck that has shown up on the channel a couple of times. It's a +1/+1 counter deck that leans pretty heavily into a Tyrannid sub-theme, and it can do a ton of work. He can draw a ton of cards with it, put a ton of counters on stuff. This is probably the deck that I am the most concerned about, which is a weird thing to say because we are designed to prevent combat. But I also know that the Swarmlord can just kind of hit people out of nowhere for a ton of damage. So if we have to spend our protection spells on Jorkadine, and then all of a sudden the Swarmlord shows up, we may not be able to do everything to protect from two different sources. And I think that if that's the case, the Swarmlord starts to overwhelm us. So that's my pick for the most concerning deck at the table. But I would love to hear everyone else's opinions too. So down in the comments, let me know who you think is going to walk out the winner. Make sure you get those predictions in, and then let me know if you were right in the end. But overall, thank you all so much for watching the deck tech up to this point. If you've liked the video, then I would love it if you would, actually like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're trying to make our push to 2,000 subscribers, and I would really appreciate it if you would help us get there. So with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching. Let's jump into this game. Hopefully you all enjoy it. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once we're done. At the start of the game, Cole goes first, followed by Luke, Jason, and then myself. On Cole's first turn, he plays an island. Luke plays a mountain. Jason plays a breeding pool tapped. I play a plains. Cole plays an island and casts his commander, Kami of the Crescent Moon, letting each player draw an additional card in their draw step. Luke plays a plains. Jason plays a mountain and casts Biophagus, which can tap for a mana of any color, and if that mana is spent to cast a creature, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter. I play a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Cole plays an island, then casts Arcane Signet, and also casts Emrakul's Messenger, making an Eldrazi spawn token whenever he draws his second card each turn. Luke plays a mountain, then casts Sigiled Sword of Valoron. Jason plays a forest and casts Gargoyle Flock, entering with a +1/+1 counter, and at the end of his turn, creating a 1/1 Tyrannid Gargoyle token if a creature entered under his control this turn, which the Gargoyle did, so he creates a token. I play a mountain. When Cole draws his 2 cards for turn, he creates an Eldrazi spawn token, then casts Leyline of Anticipation, letting him cast all of his spells as though they had flash. Luke plays a plains and casts Instigator Gang, giving his attacking creatures +1/+0. Jason cast a Rhythm of the Wild, giving his non-token creatures Riot and preventing his creatures from being countered. He then plays a Stomping Ground tapped and attacks me for 4 with his 2 gargoyles. But before the damage, I cast Stroke of Midnight, destroying the Gargoyle Flock, giving Jason a 1/1 human token, and then only taking 1 damage. On my turn, I play an island. Then, at the end of my turn, Cole flashes in Mischievous Mystic, letting him make a 1/1 fairy token whenever he draws his second card each turn. This means that when he draws his 2 cards on his turn, he creates a fairy token and an Eldrazi spawn token. He then plays Rivendell and passes. Luke plays a mountain and equips Instigator Gang with Sigiled Sword of Valoron, giving it +2/+0, Vigilance, and letting him make a 2/2 Knight token with Vigilance that's attacking whenever the Instigator Gang attacks. This lets him attack me for 5 and create a Knight token attacking Jason for 3. Then, in his second main phase, Luke casts Chimeric Mass for X=2, entering with 2 charge counters, and letting him pay a mana to turn it into a creature with power and toughness equal to the number of charge counters on it until the end of turn. Jason plays an island and casts Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, now doubling the number of counters he would put on a permanent or player, and halving the number of counters his opponents would put on a permanent or player. When it enters, Vorinclex also gets 4 +1/+1 counters. In response, I cycle a Desert of the Mindful just to remind the table that there's always a chance I'll have a response, and then since Vorinclex has haste, he attacks Luke with him for 10. On my turn, I play a Plains and cast Stuffy Doll, naming Cole when it enters, so any damage that is dealt to the doll is also dealt to Cole. Then at the end of turn, Cole casts Preordain, scrying 2 and drawing a card. Then when Cole draws 2 cards on his turn, he creates an Eldrazi spawn and a fairy token. After that, he casts Sphinx's Tutelage, making target opponent mill 2 cards whenever he draws a card, and then milling 2 more if the 2 milled cards were the same color, repeating this process until it mills 2 cards that are not the same color. Luke plays a Plains and casts Jalum Tome, which allows him to tap it and pay 2 mana to draw a card and discard a card. Then he also casts Forebear's Blade, and finally, he moves to combat attacking Cole with the Instigator Gang and a Knight token, then creates another Knight token that's attacking me. Cole blocks the 2 creatures attacking him with his fairy tokens, killing them, while I block with Stuffy Doll, doing 3 damage to Cole anyway. Jason plays a Forest and casts the Great Henge, which can tap for 2 mana, gain Jason 2 life, lets him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature he controls when it enters, and also lets him draw a card when a creature he controls enters. In response, Cole cycles a Mirror Shell Crab, countering the Henge unless Jason pays 3, which, thanks to the cost reduction from Vorinclex, he's able to pay, allowing the Henge to resolve. After that, Jason casts Garruk's Uprising, gaining 2 life, drawing a card since he controls a creature with power 4 or greater, giving his creatures trample, and now letting him draw a card whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters under his control. Finally, he attacks me for 10 with Vorinclex, and I block with Stuffy Doll. Thankfully, Jason chooses not to trample over the doll, doing all 10 damage to it, so Cole takes the 10 damage instead. On my turn, I play an island and cast an Azorius Signet. Then at the end of turn, Cole sacrifices both of his Eldrazi spawn to cast Stag Diamond. Then when Cole draws for turn, he makes another Eldrazi spawn, makes a fairy, and mills me for 4. He then plays an island and passes. Luke plays a Gargoyle Castle, then casts Hoarding Dragon, searching his library for an artifact, specifically Metalwork Colossus, exiling it and putting it into his hand when the dragon dies. After that, he attacks Jason for 11 with his entire board, and creates another Knight that's attacking Cole for 3. Jason blocks the Instigator and the Knight with his Soldier and Gargoyle tokens, killing both of them while only taking 3, and Cole blocks the Knight with a Fairy token, killing it and taking no damage. Jason plays a mountain, then casts Tyrannid Prime, giving all his creatures evolve, gaining 2 life, drawing a card, and putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it. Then he casts his commander the Swarm Lord, drawing 2 cards, putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it, evolving the Tyrannid Prime, giving his commander haste, and now drawing a card whenever one of his modified creatures dies. This lets him attack Luke for 9 with the Swarm Lord, and attack me for 10 with Vorinclex. I block with the Stuffy Doll, and Luke blocks with his Hoarding Dragon, killing it and putting Metalwork Colossus into his hand. Then I take 9, Luke takes 5, and Cole takes 1 thanks to the Stuffy Doll. At the end of turn, I cycle Desert of the Fervent, and also taps the Stuffy Doll to do 1 damage to itself. That then does 1 damage to Cole. On my turn, I cast my commander, Sevinne the Chronoclasm, preventing all damage that would be dealt to him, and copying the first spell I cast from my graveyard each turn. Once that resolves, I cast Pariah, enchanting Sevinne, so all damage that would be dealt to me is dealt to him. Finally, I play a Myriad Landscape, and at the end of turn, Cole casts Stroke of Genius for X=6, drawing 6 cards and targeting me with all 6 Sphinx's tutelage triggers. This mills me for 14 total cards, and notably, I do mill over a Past in Flames, which has flashback and gives my other spells flashback when cast. When Cole draws for his turn, he creates an Eldrazi Spawn and a Fairy token, also milling me for another 4 cards. He then plays an island and casts Chasm Skulker, getting a +1/+1 counter whenever he draws a card, and when it dies, creating a number of 1/1 Squid tokens with Island Walk for each counter that it had on it. After that, he cast Min, Wily Illusionist, creating a 1/1 illusion token that gets +1/+0 for each other illusion whenever he draws his second card each turn, and whenever an illusion he controls dies, he can put a permanent with mana value less than or equal to its power from his hand into play. At the end of turn, Luke activates Jalum Tome, drawing a card and discarding a card. On Luke's turn, he plays a mountain, then attacks Jason for 11 with Instigator Gang and 2 knights, and also attacks Cole for 3 with another knight token, creating yet another knight that is also attacking Cole for 3. Cole blocks with 2 fairy tokens, killing them both and taking no damage, while Jason blocks the Instigator with Tyrannid Prime, killing Luke's attacker while Jason takes 6. In his second main phase, Luke cast Kirtar's Wrath, destroying all creatures, letting Jason draw 3 cards thanks to his commander. In response, Cole sacrifices his spawn and delves away his graveyard to cast Treasure Cruise, drawing 3, milling me for 6, and then the board wipe resolves, now making Cole 3 Squid tokens. Once all of that has resolved, Luke casts Metalwork Colossus for only 2 mana, since its cost is reduced by the mana value of non-creature artifacts he controls. Jason plays a Training Center and casts Malanthrope, gaining 2 life, drawing a card, giving it haste, exiling my graveyard when it enters, and getting 3 +1/+1 counters since there were 3 creature cards exiled this way. After that, he casts Termagant Swarm for X=5, entering with 5 +1/+1 counters, drawing 3 cards, giving it haste, and making a number of 1/1 Tyrannid tokens when it dies equal to its power. This lets him attack me for 12 with both of his creatures, and I block with Stuffy Doll, doing 1 damage to Cole, but still take the remaining 11. On my turn, I play an island and cast a Blazing Sunsteel, then pass. When Cole draws his 1 card for turn, he manages to mill me for 8 total cards, then he recast his commander, Kami of the Crescent Moon. After that, he cast a Spark Double, entering as a non-legendary copy of Kami of the Crescent Moon, except it also gets a +1/+1 counter. Luke plays a Sanctum of Ugin and equips Metalwork Colossus with Forebear's Blade, giving it +3/+0, Vigilance, and Trample. This lets him attack Jason for 13 with the Colossus. Then, in his second main phase, Luke casts a Thopter Assembly, which returns itself to his hand and makes 5 1/1 Thopter tokens in his upkeep, as long as he doesn't control another Thopter. Jason plays an unclaimed territory, naming Tyrannid when it enters, so it can tap for mana of any color, but only for Tyrannids. Then he cast Herald of Secret Streams, gaining 2 life, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it, drawing a card, and making his creatures with counters unblockable. After that, he cast Tyrant Guard for X = 0, drawing a card, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, giving it haste, and giving him the option to sacrifice it to give creatures he controls with counters hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. This lets him attack me with everything except the Herald for 16 damage, but before damage I cast Aether Spouts, putting all attacking creatures on the top or bottom of their owner's libraries. In response, Jason cast Counterspell to counter my protection spell and attempt to knock me out of the game. Luckily for me, Cole is feeling benevolent, casting Long River's Pull to counter Jason's counterspell, gifting a card to Luke, allowing my Aether Spouts to resolve, and keeping me in the game. On my turn, I play an island and cast Aurelia the Law Above, letting me draw a card when a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, and also do 3 damage to each opponent while I gain 3 life whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures. Since Aurelia also has haste and vigilance, I attack Jason with her for 4. When Cole draws his 3 cards for turn, he mills Jason for 6 and mills me for 2. Then on Luke's turn, he plays a Plains, casts his commander, Jor-Kadeen the Prevailer, giving his creatures +3/+0 as long as he controls 3 or more artifacts, which he does. In response, Jason casts Ravener, putting 2 counters on it, drawing a card, and forcing Luke to attack Cole with his Colossus this turn. At this point, we also remember that Thopter Assembly should have returned to Luke's hand, so he returns it and creates 5 1/1 Thopter tokens. Jason then attacks Cole with the Colossus for 16, but Cole responds by casting Mystic Confluence, returning the Colossus and Jason's Herald to their owner's hands, and he also draws a card, making Jason mill 4. In his second main phase, Luke cast a Frontline Medic, which gives his creatures indestructible when it attacks with at least 2 other creatures. Then he also recast Metalwork Colossus, sacrificing Sanctum of Ugin when it does, to search his library for a colorless creature, specifically Beast of Burden, putting it into his hand. On Jason's turn, he plays a Rejuvenating Spring, then cast Hull Breach, destroying Cole's Sphinx's Tutelage and my Blazing Sunsteel. Then he recast his commander, the Swarmlord, gaining 2 life, drawing 2 cards, giving it haste, and putting 5 +1/+1 counters on it. This lets him attack Luke for 10 with the Swarmlord, and at the end of turn, I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, and also doing 1 damage to Cole with Stuffy Doll. On my turn, I simply play an Is It Boilerworks, returning an island to my hand, and pass. But at the end of turn, Cole flashes in Mindstone. On Cole's turn, he plays an island, then casts Clone Legion, targeting me so he creates a token copy of each creature I control. In response, I cast Dualcaster Mage to copy the Clone Legion and choose new targets for it. This allows me to target myself with the copy, creating another Stuffy Doll, Aurelia, which dies immediately, and most importantly, another Dualcaster Mage. The new Dualcaster Mage allows me to again copy the original Clone Legion that's on the stack, effectively allowing me to copy it an infinite number of times. Since Cole's original Clone Legion will resolve after mine and give him copies of everything I create, I choose to stop at 6,000, having 2,000 Stuffy Dolls naming each of my opponents, while Cole does the same. After all of that has resolved, Cole attacks Jason with his copy of Aurelia and his 3 Squid tokens, allowing him and I to both draw a card, while Jason takes 7. Luke cast Beast of Burden, which has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures in play, so it's currently a 24,020, 24,020. Jason cast Exocrine for X = 9, doing 9 damage to each player and creature, wiping the board, but more importantly, making each of the 12,000 copies of Stuffy Doll deal 9 damage to their chosen targets. Unfortunately for me, this means that Cole's triggers resolve before mine, doing 18,000 damage to each of his opponents, knocking them all out before my triggers can resolve, winning Cole the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. It probably had one of the best endings to any game that I've either ever played or have played in a very long time. We all were genuinely just laughing the entire time, having a phenomenal time at the end of that game because it was just so absurd, and we all contributed to kind of just an absolute chaotic mess right there at the end. So being able to have just quite literally 24,000 creatures in play, being able to do 18,000 damage is absolutely absurd. And every single player contributed in some way, whether it was me making all of those copies because of Cole's spell, Cole being able to use those copies to great effect, Luke making a massive creature in Beast of Burden that could just one-shot us for the rest of time, and then, of course, Jason casting the board wipe that did all of that damage right at the end. So it was an absolute blast to play that game. And looking back on it, I think that we definitely struggled a bit because of the mill, but overall, I still think our deck performed very well. We did good at kind of preventing these attacks and showing our opponents that we always had something to do, so that by the end of the game, people didn't want to attack us quite as much as they did at the beginning of the game, which I think is a success of the deck. This is definitely one of those decks that the more you play it, the more you learn some of the nuance to it, and the more that your opponents learn what's in the deck, I think you're going to be very good at preventing these attacks and probably win pretty regularly with it. I do genuinely think that this is a powerful deck, even though we did not wind up winning. I still think it did everything it needed to do. As for our opponents, everyone else's decks really showcased what they could do. I think that Cole, which our winner, so a huge shout out to Cole on a phenomenal victory, did really well. The drawing 2 cards synergies really did a lot more than I thought they were going to, and it was very impressive to see how much Kami could stick around, because nobody wanted to kill it, nobody wanted to lose that card draw, but Cole was easily the one benefiting the most from it. So it was super, super cool deck from Cole. The budget rare list, or the bulk rare list, I suppose I should say, coming from Luke, also very, very sweet. There were a lot of cards that are just absolutely fun cards to play that you don't see too much in Commander. Being able to see like the Hoarding Dragon and the Metalwork Colossus and things like that were just a ton of fun. There are cards that, for a lot of them, I have a lot of nostalgia for, because that was when I really played Standard a lot, so it's nice to see them come back out. And then, last but not least, of course, Jason and the Swarm Lord, just an absolute powerhouse of a deck. Being able to draw 1 to 2 cards every time he cast a creature because of the Great Henge and Garruk's Uprising, being able to give all of his stuff haste and riot with Rhythm of the Wilds, he really just had the setup, and I do think that if given enough time, and if he'd been able to knock us out, so if Cole had stopped him from, killing us, then he probably would have just won the game. So definitely a very sweet interaction at the very end. A lot of fun was had, and it was definitely one of those games that we still kind of talk about in our Discord from time to time because it was just that absurd. So thank you all so much for watching. Please do let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you think that we should add to this deck or take out of this deck. I would love to hear some suggestions, but overall, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate all of it. I appreciate all the likes, and the subscriptions as well. But just the views are phenomenal. It really does mean the world to me to be able to share all of these decks with you. So thank you all again, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.